All right, so let's get back to the tips for centering and throwing 6 to 8 inches tall. I have 3 pounds of clay. I've stuck the clay to the wheel, and now I'm going to teach you a really quick technique called slap centering. Now the clay, if I rotate it, it's not exactly centered, but I want it to be centered before I even get water on my hands. So what I'm going to do is take my dry hands and I'm going to spin the wheel slowly, and I'm slapping the clay into the center of the wheel or into the center of the rotation. You can do this at first just with one hand. This is definitely different than tap centering, which is a trimming technique to center a piece. This is slap centering, and it does help, again, wake up the clay and helps get the clay centered so that you're ready to throw and you're not fighting a large chunk of clay that has a big bulge on the side. Once it's in this Hershey Kiss shape or this kind of volcano dome shape, I'm going to then wet my hands and I'm going to do the same centering techniques I taught at the beginning. We're going to center the outside first and make sure that the bottom is stuck to the wheel. And then we're going to cone up and cone down so that we're centering the inside.
I'm going to stay wide for this first
one.
Yeah,
sure.
And then the next one I'm going to do completely.
Yeah, Kurt's going to do a forward-facing one for the first one, and then he'll do a side camera for the next one. All right, so what I'm doing is tucking my left elbow into my belly and resting onto the tray. And really this palm right here, the pinky and the palm, is the part that's going to push against the clay the best or the hardest. And then my thumb is just going to rest on top. My right hand does a lot of pulling, and I'm using my pinky to at the beginning to seal that clay up. And then I'm going to incorporate all 4 of my fingers and then also my right pinky palm to pull the clay toward my body as well. So let's get that clay wet again. And now I'm going to push, and notice where my head goes. It goes right over the clay. And my chin is directly above the clay. And I'm just waiting for the clay to center. I'm not like muscling it too much. Just be patient. The clay will react and respond to what you're doing. And try not to switch positions or switch pressure, because you don't want to add too many variables to what you're doing. So if you're learning how to center large amounts of clay, if you start moving anchor points or switching hands, you're never going to learn the process, because you need to stick with one and get better at that. So here's what I'm hoping you will learn, is that my left palm is pushing against the clay, right? And then my right hand is pulling. And I'm not looking for perfect center right now, because the clay hasn't been centered on the inside, so it's kind of lumpy on the inside still. So the next thing I'm going to do is cone up. And I cone up by pushing a little bit harder with my left palm and pulling more aggressively with my right fingertips until I see the clay move upward. And my wheel is spinning about medium speed. Okay, so I see the clay start to move, and I'm going to follow the clay upward. You can see that my hands are kind of bouncing around, and that's because, again, the clay is still fighting against me. I haven't really centered the inside yet. So we've exposed some of that clay, and now I'm going to push the clay down. Sometimes the clay skirts out too much. You'll get extra clay down here. You can use the back of your thumb and scrape the clay away, or you can go and use one of your rib tools and help scrape some of the clay away. But I try and teach to keep as much of the clay intact as you can and not remove it. So you just want to move that clay around. So the next part is, once I've pushed with my left palm and pulled with my right fingertips, I'm just going to rotate this left hand up and over the clay. Now this is the tricky part because it's hard to explain this over the camera, but I'm going to do my best. What I'm trying to do is not push straight down. Like this is what some people might think you do, is you push down. But look what happens. It turns into like this maybe mushroom top, and it actually throws it off more off center. And it would take a ton of pressure to push down. So I couldn't physically do that. So what I'm trying to do, I'll get it back up to that cone shape. What I'm actually doing is I'm pushing it off center toward 12 o'clock. So straight at my tray, I want to push the clay. And where do you put the clay? You put it right in your palm. So I'm gonna wipe my hands off so that you can see exactly where the touching is happening. Okay, so I have dry hands now. Where the clay goes is almost like you're shaking someone's hand with your left hand, and you keep your left thumb over the top of the clay, but you keep your left fingers parallel with the side of the clay. Make sure you have enough water. So what I do is I take water and I drizzle it on my hand and it drizzles down. So I'm going to lean into the clay. And again, don't switch positions, just wait for the clay to respond. And then you can see exactly where I'm touching the clay. And my hand is still parallel with the side, and my thumb is over the top. So it's creating this shape here. All right, and then you notice my right hand I was using that for leverage to push against, and then keeping my elbows tight into my body and pushing down. And I waited, and the clay responded and did what it was supposed to do. So now I'm going to pull the clay back up and push it down. And I taught in the first beginning lesson that I would scrap all this slip and put it in my bucket. Sometimes I add that to the surface, and then I add water on top of that just to get a little bit more lubrication for the clay there. Okay, so I'm pushing it off center. And then pushing down, and then centering the outside. So that's 2 times. And I'm feeling that the clay is actually getting more obedient, I guess you could say. It's moving in the right direction. So I'm going to do this one more time. Coning up. Then coning down, and this should be my 3rd and final center. And if at this point the clay is skirted out too far, this is where you could scrape some of that clay off. I clean my hand and the wheel at this point. So I clean as I go. Helps me relax because, muscling that clay around at that point probably took a little breath out of my lungs. So I'm going to just scrape any extra clay off the side with my rib tool or the back of my thumb. And now my hands are clean, so I got to get them wet again. And then I'm ready to move on to the next step, which is entering. All right, before I move on to entering, is there any questions about moving 3 pounds of clay through using that centering technique? I want to make sure that I make that clear and you guys understand.
1 second to throw out questions.
Yeah. So this is 3 pounds of clay. I do this for 3 to 7 pounds. So this is the same technique that I would use. I'm waiting for the clay to move and respond and keeping my hand in the same position. Don't rotate, don't switch, don't adjust your body. Just leave your hands in one spot, push. And if the clay's not moving, then you just need to keep applying a little bit more pressure until you see the clay moving upward.
No question.
All right. So we're going to move on to entering. So entering, opening, and are very similar to the first beginning wheel process. So I'm going to enter with my left thumb and I'm leading with my thumb pad, not my thumb tip. So my thumb pad is going to create more of a wider opening. Instead of like boring a hole down into the center, I'm creating this big crater. And I'm adding some water in there, and then I'm pushing down. And I want to make sure to leave at least a half of an inch, 3/8 of an inch down at the bottom. And I know that by experience, but you can also test with the needle tool. And for opening a larger amount of clay, I do use my right fingers and my left thumb together. So instead of putting all my weight on my left thumb, I'm going to slide my right finger off, my middle finger, and I'm going to pull the clay toward my belly. It's important to wait for the clay to respond to your pressure. Otherwise, you're going to pull it too quickly, or you're going to throw off your whole piece of clay off center by pulling too quickly. So just wait. You'll feel the clay kind of expand into this nice donut shape if you do this correctly. So I'm only opening the bottom 3 inches wide. 3 inches is what I'm aiming for. And then once I have it open 3 inches, I'm going to compress and flatten the bottom using a rib tool. And again, waiting for the clay to respond, becoming flat, patience. And then all this extra clay that was on my rib, take off, put it into my slop bucket, and return my tool to the tool carrier. All right, this is where it becomes different than the first, the beginning stages. This is where my intermediate lesson happens. I'm going to change my approach to pulling the clay in 2 ways. The first way, I'm going to do a pull as I bring the clay up and into a volcano shape. I'm going to actually pinch with my right hand thumb against my right fingers, and I do that on the right side. So instead of using my left hand on the right side, I'm using my right hand on the right side. You could also do this with your left hand together simultaneously. It might take a little bit more practice to do this evenly with both hands. So that's why I just stick with one hand doing all the work. What I'm going to do is use my left palm to push the clay inward. And because there's a lot of clay here, I want to pinch the clay with my right hand and start pulling up into a tall volcano shape. So that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm pushing with my left palm and then pinching with my right hand against my right fingertips. So that was doing 2 things at once that you're going to have to practice. And what that looked like again was my left palm is pushing just like when I was centering, and my right thumb is pinching against the clay into my right fingertips, or right fingers. So that's the hand position right there. All right, now that I've done this, I have a nice volcano shape. I have extra clay down here, which I'm going to gather and pull up. And I'm going to do that in 2 steps. The first step is I'm going to gather the clay with my pinkies and my pinky palms and set myself up for success in this next pull. So I actually learned this from a student of mine, a high school student. He was doing this weird thing with his hands, and I was like, "What are you doing?" And he told me he was creating that little divot under there so that when he pulled the clay up, it was already ready to go. So I thought that was a genius way to approach a larger amount of clay. And so I started teaching this to my students as well. All right, so now I have this little belly here that's already ready to pinch and pull up. And you could, if you're used to the knuckle pull, you could do the knuckle pull from here. I still use my fingertips, and I still avoid the sponge for larger amounts of clay. All I want to do is just make sure that there's enough water on my hands so that when I pinch, the clay isn't dragging my thumb through the clay and sticking. All right, so here we go. I can't really get my thumb down and pinch and pull, so I'm going to use my fingertips. And I'm going to move that lump of clay upward to the rim. So a lot more pressure happens at the bottom, and as I move up towards the rim, the clay becomes thinner, and I don't have to apply the same pressure at the rim. I release the pressure, make sure that it's level and balanced, and then take my hands off. Anytime we're working with the clay, we want to approach the clay softly, make our pressure, add our pressure, and then remove the hands just as slow as we approach. All right, we're going to establish our rim. Make sure that that rim is thick and strong, and we can do that by straddling with our left thumb and index finger and pointing with our right, like this, or you could do the webbing technique. So I use the webbing in between my middle and index finger on my left hand, and I'm pushing down, and I'm strengthening the rim and keeping it thick, and also balancing it. All right, so let's do another pull. So that was technically it was our first pull because the first one was just recentering the clay, but it was kind of a pull at the beginning as well. So I want to take this skirted clay here and tuck it under.
So it's saying, can you talk about the wheel speed and the speed that you're pulling the clay, and how are those two speeds related?
Yes, excellent question. That is something I did want to talk about. So the wheel speed is medium to medium slow. And I can kind of see the bat pin holes as I'm spinning the wheel. This would be way too fast, and I would probably lose control. And then this is probably too slow, where I would have to really slow down my pull. So the speed that you're pulling the clay up is in relationship with the speed that you're turning the wheel. So the faster that you're turning the wheel, the faster you can pull up. The slower you're turning the wheel, the slower you're going to pull the clay up. And those definitely do relate together. And then I forgot to talk about the speed for centering. So at first, the clay is lumpy, and it's going to kind of move your hands and jostle them back and forth, right? So think about driving your car on a flat tire, and you have this like thump, 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 right? You want to slow down your car when you have a flat tire. You don't want to speed up because that's going to throw your car into this jostling way. So same thing with the clay. If you feel like the clay is off center and moving around, you want to actually slow your wheel down. It's kind of counterintuitive. You think, oh, I'll go faster to correct it, but it's actually going to cause that bump to spin out of control. So we want to slow our wheel down. If we ever feel like we're off center or our hands are about to lose control, we want to slow the wheel down in relationship to what's happening.
Any reason you don't use a sponge while pulling?
The reason why I don't use a sponge while I'm pulling is because I add enough water to the surface of the clay that I don't need to keep reintroducing it with the sponge. And I want to make sure that my fingertips are touching the clay so I can feel any pressure or anything I need to adjust along the way. So I can feel the thickness of the clay, I can feel the dryness of the clay, and then I can also feel the pull, the pinch and pull that's happening here. All right, so let's get to the next pull. So my left hand is now my left elbow is going to go up in the air. And I started with that little kind of tuck. We'll call that the mighty tuck because we're tucking the clay under. What we're doing is we're kind of gathering the thicker amount of clay and gathering it into this little lump. And now my inside finger is going to push where that lump is. And my outside hand is going to gather the clay underneath. And sometimes you end up with like extra clay coming off. That's okay, we can just get rid of that. All right, and then after I'm done with this pull, I'm going to show you what's happening on the inside. Again, at the bottom, there's more pressure. Top, less pressure when I get to the rim. And I do want to make sure that my outside hand is pushing slightly harder than my inside hand. If my inside hand is pushing out farther or harder, you're actually going to turn into a big bowl. Bowls are not what we're making. We're making tall cylinders. All right, if the rim does get flared out, you can surround the clay like this and slowly push in until we have that volcano shape. All right, so what is happening on the inside of the clay? I'm going to take this off and show you my ceramic or my fist-fired demo piece. And then maybe I'll cut one of these in half and show you what's happening also on the inside. This bat system makes it easy to take a piece off and put it right back on and kind of pick up where I left off. So I made this, stopped my pull midway, cut it in half, and then I fist fired this. So now I have a good example of what is happening on the inside without having to cut my cylinder in half every time I'm giving this demo. So my left hand is on the inside, and you notice that my left elbow is facing up. So what's happening is my left finger is pushing against this little lump and expanding the clay outward. All right, it's pushing it outward, so it's creating width at this point. Then my right fingertips are tucked right underneath, and I'm pulling that lump of clay up. And instead of making it wider, we're going to expand it to make it taller. That's like a little explanation of what's happening and where my fingers are on the inside. And we're expanding this clay and pulling that all the way up to the top.
So I'm going to ask, if you're finding that your pot is getting sticky and dry as you pull up, do you just slowly go off and get more water?
Yes, so if your hands start to stick and get dried out, just go back into, stop what you're doing, dunk your hand in the clay, dunk your hand in the water, and drizzle some more water onto the surface. So I'll do that right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pinch and pull the clay up. Oh, my hands are getting dry, so I'm going to release the pressure, add some more water, and then go right back where I started or where I left off. And once I can touch my left hand with my right hand, I do. Creates balance. Notice where my right hand is. It's tucked into my belly or into my body, into my chest. And once the clay gets too tall, I stand up, and now I can lean right over the top, and I have control over that cylinder. I have a 3-pound ball of clay, and we're at 8 inches tall. So I would say that 3 pounds, you're aiming for about 6 to 8 inches in height. And then from there, you can obviously add more clay and get taller. I'm going to cut this in half and show you what it looks like. And before I do that, I'm going to remove some of the extra clay at the bottom. And then I'm going to compress the walls. So compressing the walls is important. Just like when you stretch out a clay slab, you always want to take a rib and compress the surface because you stretch the particles apart. And you're doing the same thing when you're throwing. So before you start shaping, you want to compress the walls using a rib tool. You could use 2 rib tools, one on the inside, one on the outside, or you could push against your fingers. So I put my left hand inside like that. So this whole part is resting against the inside. And I'm pushing slightly against the rib tool. I usually don't push the rib tool into the clay because that can throw it off center really easily. So I'm going to stretch the clay slightly outward. And I'm holding that rib tool in the same spot, moving up together. This is removing extra clay, slip, and compressing the walls. So look at all that extra slip that came off. Now, if your clay was wet or kind of sloppy or slippery, you removed a lot of that slip, and now you're ready to do the shaping. But I'm going to cut this one in half and show you what's happening on the inside. All right, when I cut these things in half, I cut them halfway through the bottom and then go straight up with it. All right, so the inside, we have a nice thick bottom that we can trim. This one was a little, like maybe a little bit thicker than I typically do, but about 1/2 inch, so I can trim 1/4 inch. And the walls are pretty even all the way up. So I'm going to trim, a little bit of that clay off. So what's happening when I'm throwing, this is a good demo as well, because it's going to show you what's happening with the clay. So I'm going to start at the bottom and I'm pinching the clay together. And then as I pull the clay up, you can see I get to the rim and I hold steady and then I release. This side, this wall that I pinched and pulled up, is slightly taller than the other side. That's because I pinched and pulled the walls taller. So again, the inside finger is above the outside finger, and my outside finger is supporting that clay. I do encourage you to make tall cylinders and cut them in half and see what's going on the inside. But once you get the hang of it, you don't have to cut them in half anymore. You can do.
What do you do when you feel an air bubble in the clay as you're pulling?
If you feel an air bubble in the clay, hopefully it pops as you are pulling because the pressure will push the air bubble out. If it causes any kind of wobbly then I would stop the wheel, take your needle tool, poke holes all the way through the wall where the hole is, and then push the air out if you can, and then go back and do a pull again. Or you could do a compression so that that kind of hole in the wall gets compressed. If it's too large of a air bubble that will cause the whole thing to fall apart, you might want to scrap it and start over, but hopefully you can adjust as you go along. All right, we're going to get another 3-pounder and then do this process. I'm not sure if you're switching back and forth on the views.
This one's going to be entirely over the side.
So this is going to be showing from the right side of my body. I'm going to talk less and show you the process. Oh, I just slap center. Got to do this right, Kevin. I was like jumping right into it. Okay, so we have 3 pounds of clay. My hands are dry, and then I'm going to slap center the clay. So that Hershey kiss, wet my hands, wet the clay, and I'm pushing against my left palm and pulling with my right fingertips. Once I feel my hands getting sticky, I add a little bit of water to the top. All right, now I've centered the outside. I'm going to center the inside by coning. So I'm pushing with my left palm and pulling with my right fingertips. And then I'm pushing down, so I'm rotating my wrist up and over, and then pushing at an angle away from my body. And then if the clay is skirting out and kind of off center, I just scrape some of that extra clay off. And I can still feel the inside of the clay is not really moving all in the same direction. So I'm going to do this 2 more times. Going it off center, pushing down, leaning into it. Pushing and pulling. This should be my last coning and centering. See, my right hand is kind of coming over and helping out my left thumb for this karate chop. That's definitely a technique that you can incorporate if you just don't feel like you have enough pressure to push down or push the clay off center like this. Incorporate your right hand into a karate chop and push and lean into it. So my left palm is still pushing in and my right hand is pushing down. All right, now I'm going to wipe my hands off. My clay is centered. I'm going to wipe the wheel head off as well and move on to the next step. Perfect. So once we get this into a tall cylinder, then we're going to move on now to the shaping and talk about developing a vase and a pitcher style. Enter. And about 3/8 of an inch to 1/2 an inch down, I'm going to start opening. Waiting for the clay to expand and release slowly. I'm going to do a little show and tell for you guys to show what that rib tool is doing. So I'm working on the right side of the clay and I'm applying pressure down onto the right side as the wheel's spinning. And then it's completely flat and then I remove all the extra clay and I return that to my caddy. All right, so here's the new intermediate technique on how to pull the clay up from this position. I'm going to push with my left palm and pinch with my right thumb and hand. Make sure there's enough water on there, so I'm pushing with my left palm and pulling. Doing this at the same time into a volcano shape. So again, the hand position is pushing and pulling and pinching with my right hand. And then making sure that the top rim is thick and level. All right, so for my first pull, I'm going to tuck the clay under. So I'm taking that expanded, skirted out clay and I'm pushing it inward. And now I'm going to pinch and pull the clay up. Pushing harder with my outside hand. When I get to the rim, release the pressure, but continue the pull all the way to the rim, and then take your hands off. Tuck the clay under, trying not to throw the whole thing off center. And now my elbow goes up because my hand can't reach out to support it. Pinch, 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 gather that clay, make sure you don't skip ahead. Now I can get my left thumb out. connect to my right hand, and finish the pull to the rim. It did flare out a little bit, so what I'm going to do is take my rim and bring that clay inward so that the rim doesn't get too wide. Clay is pretty tall at this point, so I'm going to stand up and do my last pull standing up. Tucking my right forearm into my belly, pinching that clay. The pressure is up and in with my outside hand, and I'm just pulling the little belly up with my inside fingers. When I get to that rim, release the pressure. Now I have a 6 to 8 inch tall cylinder using 3 pounds of clay.
Someone says this is the best pulling demo and most helpful I have ever seen.
Wow, thank you. I've done this so many times that I was telling Curt that I feel like I'm not being useful because I've heard this and I've done this so many times that I know how to do it, but I'm not in the shoes of you where you're learning this for the first time. I also would hoped that your professors or teachers before would have shown you this so that you had a leg up and you understood it all better. It's good to hear that positive feedback so that I know what I'm doing is helpful. All right, rib tool. Scrape any extra clay at the bottom. Some people leave that extra clay down there to support the weight of the clay. I really find it cumbersome, and I want to see almost the final shape, and I don't want to trim as much later too. So I want to see the final shape before I even take it off the wheel. So I do a lot of wet trimming. So I remove the clay as I go. So I really don't need it because it's a tall cylinder and it's holding and supporting itself. I also do a lot of compression with the rib tool, and I also scrape any unnecessary slip off the surface so that I don't have a wet clay. Left finger is pushing against the rib, and I'm going to compress. So all these throwing lines on the outside will disappear. And I'm angling this rib tool back slightly away from the drag. You don't want to angle it toward the drag or toward the wheel spin, because if you catch an edge, it'll go flying. So think about when you're compressing a slab, you do the same thing. You hold this at an angle towards your body and you pull it. So that's kind of what's happening with that rib tool. Sometimes my arms get tired, so if your arms are tired, just take a break and go back at it. Whew. Strengthening your body does help when you're working larger, and also working like if you're creating a bunch of these vases or a bunch of these pictures, you do need to take breaks. So we're at 9 1/4. So I made this a little bit thinner than I did on the last one, and it got taller. Even me as a professional artist on the wheel that uses the potter's wheel, my first couple are always not as good as the last few that I throw in the studio, just because you're warming up and you're getting your blood flowing. So yesterday I talked about, or the first part I talked about, using cups and mugs as a way to warm up. I think that's a great idea. Throw a couple cups and a couple mugs, take them off the wheel, and then you can up your game by throwing 3 or 4 pounds for the next level. All right, so that does actually lead us into the next stage. So how do I take a tall cylinder that I practiced so hard to get to, and now I can throw 3 or 4 pounds of clay and get a really tall cylinder? What do I do with it? Same thing with a mug. You spent all this time learning how to center and enter and open and learning the wheel process. And now I have a cylinder. What do I do? How do I make a mug, right? So you're going to look up references and ideas that you are inspired by. So some of my influences were drinking vessels, so things that you would make a cocktail out of or pour a beer into. And I'm looking at very traditional forms that are kind of tried and true. So tradition, right? I'm looking at tradition and I'm starting there. So I'm having good influences. Those things have been around, those shapes and those forms have been around forever. And there's a reason why they've been around forever, because they're good forms. So have good influences to start with. From there, you're going to create your own style. You're going to put your own life into it. And that can be after you take it off the wheel, or it could be during the throwing process. I want to give you a few more tips on how to shape, and then we'll talk more about developing your style and what you can do with the shaping to help create a unique style. So the first thing I want to do is talk about expanding the clay to make it a belly. So this is the belly out method. So you're pushing the clay out to create belly. And then we're going to talk about collaring. Collaring helps create a more narrow neck or a narrow body or area where you're squeezing the clay in. So let's talk about the belly. The belly happens by pushing out with your inside finger and supporting with your outside hand. And I actually use a rib for this point because I want to make sure that I'm compressing the clay as I'm bellying out. If I add water or if I add too much, if I just add water, then it might collapse. So I'm using this rib tool to help support and to compress. So the first, I'm just going to do a standard vase. Narrow foot, belly, shoulder, neck, lip. Okay, just like kind of an elegant, standard vase. So my left hand is going to start in the bottom. I'm going to use my fingertips only, and I'm going to push outward. And I'm doing 2 or 3 bellies to create the final shape. So I'm not doing it all at once. If I try and push it out too far all at once, it'll probably collapse. So my inside finger is right here. I'll even make like a little dent. So there's my inside finger. And my outside rib is resting on that finger. And now once I feel that, I'm going to apply pressure and almost like a screw, right? So you're pulling the thread of a screw upward. And I'm taking my time. And once I get to about 2/3 of the height, where I probably think the shoulder is going to transition into the neck, I'm going to stop my pull or stop my shaping. So I did want to talk about dividing this canvas up into thirds. I like working with thirds. You can work in halves or quarters, that's fine. But the third, so we're going to say that this is 1/3 here, this is 2/3, and then this is a full cylinder. So the bottom 2/3 are going to be my belly, my shoulder, and then the top is going to be my neck and my lip. Those are good balances or good measurements to work with. You could do the flip. So you could do a belly that comes out on the 1/3, and then the top 2/3 will be your neck and your rib. So you could play with those positions as well. So once I get to about 2/3 of the height, I'm going to stop pushing outward, and I'm just going to bring my rib tool into the rim. So now I have a nice angle here that will help support the rim if I do any altering at the rim. And honestly, you could stop here. This is a great shape. We have a nice balance. We have a nice surface. I would refine this area up here, but we're going to expand the belly a little bit more. So maybe from this shoulder, we're going to bring it out maybe another 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch. So I'm pushing right here with my inside finger, just gently pushing it out, trying not to throw it off center and keeping my left hand really steady. And then my right hand is holding that rib tool and compressing and supporting. And when I get to that shoulder, I'm going to transition into the neck and the rim. And I actually went from this position here to tucking my fingertips under to support. And that's really helpful. So I did a year kind of studying and living abroad. And I came across this artist, and he made these massive jars. And I was always wondering what's happening on the inside. And so he would always bring his hand out and show me what he was doing with his hand. And that's what I'm trying to do with you is the way that you're holding your inside hand does change as you move up and down the vase. So I'm pushing with my left finger at the bottom. And then when I get to that shoulder transition, I have to turn my wrist and I tuck my fingers under, and I'm almost holding that shoulder up so it doesn't collapse. Hopefully that was a helpful demo. All right, I'm going to switch from my shaping rib to my finishing rib, this metal rib of death, and I'm going to give my form my finish shape. And you notice I haven't added any water to this. I haven't drenched it in water, and I'm only using the pressure of my rib and my fingers. If your fingers stick, just lighten up the pressure of your finger on the inside and just let the sticky clay run over your fingertips. It's okay if they do have a little bit of drag. That's going to help with the compression. All right, so now I'm thinking about finishing the surface, so making sure I'm getting all the lines and awkward marks out. My inside finger is right there, and it's pushing against my metal rib. Every once in a while, I'm going to clean that rib. And I am flexing the rib. So if I'm holding my rib in these 4 fingers, I'm going to push with my thumb to create a nice flex. So I turn the speed of the wheel down. And this is where that flex really comes in handy, because I'm going to take that and just run it right over that curve. And there you have it. We have a really nice vase, foot, body, shoulder, and now the transition into the neck. This is where I'm going to reintroduce a little bit of water. Once I've established the bottom, I'm going to add a small amount of water right here, and I'm going to collar down the neck so that it becomes a little bit more narrow. Also notice I didn't expand or do anything with the rim. The rim is pretty much the same opening that I started with. And I'm going to introduce water by putting water in my sponge and just running it on the surface of the neck. Don't douse your pot in water at this point because you've done so much work to keep it clean and smooth. I'm almost like creating a thin layer of slip on the surface by running that sponge over that area. And then I'm going to wet my hands and make sure that they're not dripping wet, because I don't want to drip a bunch of water down the side. And now I'm going to take my index fingers, my middle fingers, and my thumb and create a 6-point collar. You could also do a collar like this, but it only happens at 4 points instead of 6 points. I think the 6 points really does help. And I'm going to surround my neck with those 6 points. And notice where I'm touching. Do do this cleaning of my hands and show you where the touches are. I wet the rim a little bit more. If you need more water, just do this sponge thing. All right, here's my 6 points. I'll show you once I get my hands full of clay, you can see exactly where the 6 points touch. So the knuckle, between my knuckles on my middle fingers and my index fingers, just the tips here, and then my thumbs is the side tips. And I'm gently applying pressure and waiting for the clay to respond and squeezing my neck in to create that final shape. So I want my neck to be as wide as my foot. So my foot and my neck, there's a relationship. And then we have a belly and a shoulder that's going to relate with my my final lip shape. Again, this is a very traditional, elegant vase. I show this as a demo, but we're going to take it up a notch and we're going to do some variations to it for our next demo. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to take my sponge, run it over the rim, make sure it's rounded, and then take my finishing rib. And this little rounded part of the rib is perfect for a neck. So I'm going to place that right in where the neck is, and then pushing clay against that area. And we have a nice transition from that neck to the shoulder. And all that extra slip is removed. And we're done. So that is a vase. Standard vase, what I can do to take it up a notch from here is I can create decoration and pattern. I can glaze. I could put it into an atmospheric firing. I could spray underglaze or paint underglaze. There's a lot I could do to create this classic shape and vase into my own, but that's obviously up to you. So that is the creative license that you have. But a standard, classic, elegant vase is a good place to start. And what I've done is I've made one, and what I've done is created a thicker rim. And the reason why I've created a thicker rim on my vase is because for my pitchers, I create a thick rim and I pull my spout from that thick rim. So I want my vase and my pitcher to relate. So I kept that thick rim on my vase so it relates to my pitcher form. And of course I'll add a handle and decorate there. Another idea is in the shaping, instead of just creating a nice curve, a uniform curve, what I've done here is I've created angles. And I did that using my finishing rib. And I'll do that on the next form. We'll go a little bit quicker because we still have trimming and handles. Yeah, we'll do that really quick. Hopefully you guys are hanging in there. Everyone's having fun, learning a ton. All right, we'll do this quickly.
Weird day.
Yeah, the weather out here is very odd. The whole time it's been odd. So a little bit more about developing ideas for your vase and your pitcher. You should think about using the same shapes and same decoration as your mug and cup that you probably already developed. If you're at intermediate level, you probably have had enough time on the wheel where you've made enough mugs and cups where you've started decorating them and you come up with a shape and an idea. So take that and enlarge it, just make it larger. So I have a mug that's very similar to the vase form. The only thing that's different is the rim, the neck, and the lip is more vase-like. My mug has to have a wide open part where you can drink from. So that's the difference. Okay, so entered, opened. Maybe I can field some questions right now while I get this one set up.
No questions here, but
Cool. All right, the next steps would be pulling and shaping. Yeah, so find good influences, good references, and I would look at history, historical forms, things that have been around for thousands of years or hundreds of years that are very traditional forms that you can incorporate into your style are great places to start. This is almost real time at how fast I throw when I'm doing a production run. So it's good to see that in real time. I have a slight wobble at the bottom, so I just held my hands in position a little bit longer to help get rid of the wobble.
we do have a side question. Do you have any books or websites to recommend to find historical pottery forms besides those Pinterest images?
I do not. But your local library or a university library will direct you to, I would say, Greek or.
Yeah, I've never seen a book that has like a compilation of forms.
Yeah, I would type in Pinterest and try and find maybe a diagram that we showed you before.
Someone else says, I feel like I don't get a lot of height on a pull, but then I feel like my fingers are pulling off clay when I try to get more height. Is it a water issue, finger positioning? I feel like it takes a lot more pulls to get the same amount of height.
Yeah, that is something I feel like comes in time, almost to the point where I would need to like physically move your fingers. Most likely, here's probably what's happening is you're pushing your fingertips together instead of having your inside finger higher than your outside finger. And you're trying to just squeeze the clay up instead of expand the clay first. So let me show you again what that looks like. So what I'm doing is I'm expanding the clay out first, right? And then that is going to translate into height once I pull it up. So my inside finger is above my outside hand. So I'm taking that bulge and I'm pulling it up and creating height with it. And I have to be very patient. Wait for the clay.
We gotta be better about repeating the questions. They can't hear me.
Oh, sorry. The question was that they have problems with not getting enough height when they do pulls, and it takes a lot more pulls. And also, they said that they were ending up pulling clay off of the wheel. And so my thought is that the person is pinching the clay together instead of expanding the clay and pulling the clay up. So give that a try. Just, it's a slight hand position, right? This is pinching the clay, and then this is where your hands would switch. So you're pushing out and pulling up. That was a good comment. That does happen a lot. So
and someone says your
Okay, so I'm going to compress the walls, and now I'm going to do a little decoration. So just changing up the angle of my finishing rib, I can create bulges and tucks in the surface to create something a little bit different. All right, yesterday or the beginning class, I talked about keeping the foot the same width, but then expanding the belly. And I'm going to do the same thing with my first pull or my first shaping. So I'm keeping the foot there and expanding the belly. And then I'm going to take this angle and just repeat it opposite. And then that's a little mark right there. I'm going to leave a slight line there. Take my finger and expand up the rib tool.
And someone says your explanations are very helpful and make so much sense. I've had others teach, but in hindsight, they were showing without a clear explanation of what is happening and why.
I don't know if I'm going to be able to repeat that one, but they can all see
it. Really wasn't.
They can all say it, but yeah.
He's actually just a host and panelist, so I don't think everyone can see it. But
okay. So the comment was my explanations are very helpful because most teachers that they've had have just shown, but my explanations of things are helping them understand it better. So thank you again for that feedback. That really does help. There we go. Something different and unique. And I'm only showing this because I did this on other vases, and I wanted to show you how I finished that. So I didn't even have to. Well, I guess I was belling out the clay and then bringing the clay back in with just using this rib tool. And what I've done is I actually altered this metal rib of death by cutting the tip off and creating it to be more sharp and more dangerous. And I have this 90-degree angle now attached or on the rib tool. And I don't mind these like little bits of clay that are sticking out because that's part of the decoration. And then the last thing I want to do is make sure that the water is out from the inside before I wire it off and take it off for finishing.
You don't have to repeat this one because it went to everybody, but it says you can tell he's an actual teacher. He knows how to break it down and is aware of the smaller increments of explanations that students need. Yeah, so as a teacher, I'm a high school ceramics teacher. As a teacher, you're taught scaffolding. And that's such a teachery word, but it does apply because when you're building a scaffold, right, you have to start with the foundation and then you put the next layer on, your next layer on. And so as a teacher, you're taught to teach in that ways because that's how people learn. You can't teach every step the first time and expect someone to get it. I'm doing that here because we're limited by time. But the great thing about a virtual workshop is that after you're done with this live, Curt's going to do all the hard work of editing and putting it onto his learning platform. And you guys have access to this forever. And you can pause and you can try one part and then repeat it, and then go back and push play and then repeat it. So you'll hear my voice in your head, I guess, when you fall asleep now at night, unless you put me on mute and you just watch my hand positions. But oh man, there's lots to teach. Okay, so I'm going to end here and we're going to get to trimming really quick and then we're going to do handles. Pitcher. I got to do a pitcher. So I'm going to do my 4-pound pitcher really quick. One question before that. Do you have any tips for narrow neck vases?
Narrow neck. So like almost closed off.
That seems like a bottle, yeah.
Or yeah, okay, so when you're collaring, you're just going to keep bringing the clay in, bringing it in. Also, one of the techniques that I would recommend is that when you're bringing your clay inward, keep it at this angle. Don't try and squeeze it all off because it might collapse. The shoulder will get too weak and then too much pressure will push the neck down into the shoulder. So keep your your long neck and your bottleneck, right? Like this. And then the final closing is when you can take this part and kind of squeeze it into a tall, narrow neck. I'm not going to demo that, but that's the concept that I've learned. It's really physics, right? Keeping the piece from collapsing. Okay, so this is 4 pounds. I'm going to use 4 pounds for a pitcher because I want a pitcher to be larger than my vase so that it can hold lots of liquid. And the trick with a pitcher is that you make it thin. You make it light. So this might be leading kind of into the advanced level of throwing where you're actually going beyond what you feel comfortable the thickness of your walls should be to get that extra height and the extra weight away. Because the worst thing that you could do with a pitcher is make it really thick and heavy, and then you fill it with water, and then it's really hard to pour. And hold. So all right, a lot of this pitcher demo I learned from an artist called, his name is Matt Sheeman. He's out of Florida, and he and his father make incredible pitchers, handles and spouts. I really learned from Matt Sheeman. And that's, once I learned how to do what he was doing, that's kind of the style that I stuck with. Well, maybe you can look him up and put his link in there. And then also Todd Pletcher is another artist that I really recommend looking up for handles. He does a great pitcher and spout as well. All right, with pitchers, I'm going to leave my rim thicker than the walls. So slightly thicker, not double thickness, but slightly thicker, because I'm going to use that clay to pull a spout. So let me tuck this clay under and do one good pull here. So I'm going to do a technique that I learned in Taiwan that maybe some of you have seen other teachers do, but this is where I tuck my hand under and I'm using my thumb and my fingers to support and pull the clay.
Who is the person you mentioned before, Todd?
Matt Sheeman.
You know, I'll look it up.
Yeah, Shieman. There might be a double letter in there. All right, so this one I can probably get to about 11 inches tall. I'm getting a little tired, a little winded. Moving a lot of clay around. But I'm a professional, I can do it.
Matt Sheeman.
Matthew, maybe? Matthew Sheeman? Oh, S-C-H-I. I'm terrible at spelling. Okay, so when I get to this part is the rim that I want to keep thick. So I'm not going to finish the pull. I'm just going to leave it thick.
Oh, Matt Sheeman, S-C-H-I-E-M-A-N-N.
There you go.
We'll see.
Slappy, Swanson.
Oh, he does all the dots.
Samsonite. Yeah, that's his newer work, but it's really the form that I'm talking about.
Oh,
the form
as
and
long as it's him, I will.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, okay. He does wood. He used to do a lot of wood-fired work. Now he's doing very intricate dot work. Okay, I'm going to stand up for one of my final pulls here. So this is the part where I'm like, wow, this is getting really thin. It's almost beyond my comfort level, but it's going to help with keeping that weight down for a large pitcher. All right, and then another intermediate tip would be shaping and pulling at the same time. So I'm actually going to be pinching the clay against the rib tool as I pull up. So there's some clay that's going to be pulled up and expanded, and I'm going to shape into my form. So I'm slowing the wheel down, and I'm going to gather some clay so you can see a little lump there, and I'm pulling the clay up, and I'm stretching the clay now. I'm looking for about 2/3 of my height. And then I'm going to actually make the neck a little bit longer for my pitcher form. So I'm going to stop there and start collaring in the neck. So all this extra clay up here is left there on purpose for my rim and for my spout. And this is where I'm going to wet the top here and start collaring in. And I'm going to use just kind of this choking method to get more aggressive. And use my finishing rib here to create the nice shoulder. And then really establish this rim. I'm going to angle this lip inward. And then wet trim. So I'm going to trim off some of this extra clay at the bottom with the trimming tool while it's still wet. I don't trim these pots upside down like a traditional vase or a cup because it'll have a lip on it. I'm going to remove clay now. So this is intermediate advanced technique where I'm just removing extra clay with the trimming tool. I want to go around once and then remove this clay. Go around again and remove the clay. Once I do some wet trimming, I'm going to go back in with my finishing rib and clean that up. All right, that's a nice form. So I'm going to dry my hands, clean them and dry them, and then we're going to get the spout done, and then we'll talk about handles. And we should be done. Then we'll move into our question and answer for the intermediate stage. All right, what am I doing for the spout? So I'm going to do this on this side so you can see, but I typically do it closer to me so I can see. But I'm going to wet my fingertips, and I'm working with about 2 inches of the clay, and I'm going to start by pinching and pulling the clay up and releasing at the rim. I don't want the rim to be paper thin, so I don't want to have a thin lip. So once I've done that, establish the sides, I'm going to move inward and pull the clay up. So what's happening is now that thick clay is getting thinner and it's moving up into a spout shape.
Since that is, do you know from experience how much extra clay was at the bottom for the wet trim? I can usually tell when I pick it up if it's still a guess.
How much clay is down there? I don't know how
So
much
repeat
clay.
it a little bit.
Oh,
like,
sorry.
Do you know
Yeah,
from
so-
experience how much the wet trim?
The bottom, so the question is, how much clay do I trim off the bottom? I didn't trim too much, so maybe 1/8 of an inch thick. I just know by experience. I guess I don't have a tip for knowing how much to trim off. What I was looking for was the shape. So I wanted this foot to be more narrow, so I just removed some clay. Other people have done that same technique using a wood tool, and they stab the clay and then it kind of expands. I find that cumbersome. I find it difficult, so I just trim clay. And usually the bottom is thicker. I mean, that's just given for anyone at any level. You're going to have more clay at the bottom of your pot. So go ahead and trim off as much as you feel is needed to see the final shape. All right, so I have a thick rim and I'm pulling that clay up. Again, that lip, I don't want to like keep squeezing where that lip is. I want to just release the clay straight up. And I'm trying to make this a nice, clean, round lip. I'm going to take my sponge and just go up and over. Add a little bit of water. And this is where my challenge came for finishing a spout. You could finish the spout like this, but I found that this little trick gave it all the personality I needed. And what's happening is I'm creating a transition from the rim to the spout by putting 2 fingers on the piece. My right finger is on the inside, my left finger is on the outside, and then I'm kind of squeezing or crossing my fingers like that. And then I'm going to switch on the other side. I'm going to push out from the inside and kind of squeeze my fingers together like that. And what that did, I'm not sure what camera we're on. Forward facing?
We're on the side now.
The side, okay. So what that did was this round rim transitions from here to the round spout. Transitions over and back around here. And I did that, again, by putting 1 finger on the inside of the spout and 1 finger on the outside and just tucking that corner in. And then, yeah, that's a better view. I'm going to take this. Now, don't mess with it too much when it's wet because you can always mess with it later when it's in the leather hard stage. All right, one thing about the throat and the belly. So right now I have a weird fold or a weird transition from the belly to the throat. So I'm gonna just expand this part right here so the water flows from the belly to the throat nicely. And it's not interrupting my rim or my lip. And again, I can mess with that later too, especially when it's leather hard. It might move a little bit easier. Right now, any movement that I make, it really adjusts the whole rim and everything around it, so I don't want to mess with it too much. And then the last thing, this is really what I got from Matt Sheeman, was taking your fingers, drying them off, and I want to pull right here, I want to pull and give this whole area more lift. So you're actually altering part of the body. So I'm kind of rotating and pulling. And then when I have it high, I'm going to let go of the clay. So it just tilted that rim or that lip area up slightly. I could wait until it's a little drier to do that, and it might hold its shape better, but right now I think that looks pretty good. All right, let's move on to handles. So we're gonna transition to the different side, different view, and we're gonna talk handles.